Really excited for the lecture and glad to see so many of our friends here tonight at the Bird and Baby. So without further ado, no long-winded introduction needed here. I am proud to introduce you to this lecture on the Astari by Professor Corey Olsen, and now as we know him as Wigand or Vigand. How do we pronounce it, Corey?
Oh, Wigand. I just pronounce it with a W. Yeah.
Okay, great.
It just means warrior. I thought it was kind of a Tolkien thing to like make a fighter whose name was Fighter.
Awesome.
In Anglo-Saxon, as of course that's what most of Tolkien's names are like. As almost all of the kings of Rohan, their names just mean king in Anglo-Saxon.
Now,
so,
Corey, a little stage direction here. You might want to move over to where John is standing, since
Let's
everybody's facing his direction. He's standing in front of the door there.
Yes.
There you go.
I don't want to step on
There he is.
anybody's swans here.
And I will now give the stage to Wigand. Welcome, Wigand.
Well, thank you, everybody. As always, it is delightful to have such enthusiastic audience response. I am unaccustomed, as a rule, or at least I have been unaccustomed in times past, to be greeted in a classroom setting by people setting off fireworks, throwing flower petals in the air, summoning chickens, and standing on their heads. But that is, of course, a delightful added feature of being able to meet you guys here in game. So welcome, everybody. Today we are here to talk about the Astari tonight. The occasion, sort of, we decided that it would be fun to do combined sessions for Mythgard Monday and Ales and Tales to sort of celebrate significant dates in the history of Middle-earth. And the date around now, of course, is the time when Gandalf came back from the dead. The resurrection of Gandalf was officially yesterday, I think, if I'm remembering my dates right. So we thought that was sort of a fun occasion. So on the occasion, celebrating the anniversary of Gandalf's resurrection, I wanted to talk about Gandalf and the Astari, and mostly I would really like to do a bunch of not quite as much as I might actually like in some ways, but to do a bunch of reading. And I want to look at some passages and talk about Gandalf, and I welcome your questions. Oh, that's right, it was 2 days ago. Of course, it was on February 14th itself. You'll notice, of course, there are a number of Middle-earth events that happen on fairly memorable dates. That is like the fact that the company sets out from Rivendell on December 25th also seems to be not utterly coincidental, perhaps. But anyway, just for a kind of a point of order, we have a lot of people here tonight. We have almost 70 guests with us here in the NetMoot, and a whole crowd of people, of course, here at the Bird and Baby. And I think there are going to be too many of us to be able to turn on our mics very conveniently here. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm keeping an eye on the questions box here. So on your GoToWebinar control panel, you will see a place where you can enter text. I will get that in real time. So if you have a question you want to address, and if I get into sort of a longer discussion with somebody, I'm happy to turn on your mic. But in general, it'll save time if you can sort of just type out questions or comments that you might have. So anyway, so let's talk about Gandalf. I want to start off with two passages in The Lord of the Rings. The two passages which, in my mind, really bear very directly on the question of who Gandalf was and what is the significance of his death and resurrection. And I want to start with first a passage on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. This, I think, is a really important... I mean, of course, I don't need to tell you that Gandalf on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm is an important and interesting moment. But I think it's especially important for the question of who Gandalf is, because it's a question which in some ways we've almost not really been encouraged to ask much. That is, Gandalf is something we kind of take for granted. From the moment he's introduced in The Hobbit. Remember that really interesting kind of introduction we get of him in The Hobbit, where the narrator sort of stops and says aside, Gandalf, oh, if you'd only heard a quarter of the things that I've heard about him, and I've only heard a small bit of all that there is to know, you would be prepared for a tale of any sort. The way that the narrator manages to sort of imply so much about Gandalf without actually telling us all that very much about him. But we know he's a wizard, and we're just kind of allowed to associate stuff with that. The question of, what does that mean exactly, that he's a wizard? In The Hobbit in particular, is he just like a guy who has learned magic somehow? Is he just a very learned person? Happens to be talented or something, or learned maybe in spells, in particular, especially with the making of fire and the turning of smoke rings different colors. It's really quite unclear. He's introduced in The Hobbit as an old man. When we meet him in The Lord of the Rings, it seems relatively clear that he's something else. He's clearly not just a human, for instance, as it's been quite a long time. And people may marvel at the fact that Bilbo Baggins has aged very, very little, in the 60 years since he returned. But nobody even comments about the fact that Gandalf doesn't seem to look very much older. So it's certainly clear by the time we get to The Lord of the Rings that Gandalf is more than just a guy who knows magic. But what is he? And again, that's not really a question that we're really invited to ask. It's a passage that really sticks out, if you remember, in Minas Tirith, in The Return of the King, when Pippin is going in to meet Denethor with Gandalf, and he's sort of walking along with Gandalf. In part of that exchange that they have on the way in, that scene where Gandalf tells Pippin that if he's walked all this way with closed eyes and mind asleep, that he should wake up now. In that conversation, Pippin actually asks, it basically occurs to Pippin for the first time. He's never asked himself the question, what is Gandalf? Who is Gandalf? When did he come into the world, and what's he doing here? And the way that Pippin can go, not only for his entire life, not only for like the whole 30 years of his life, but that we can be brought all the way to book 5, of the narrative, without really being kind of compelled to ask that question ourselves. It's really kind of interesting. We kind of settle for the title, for the name wizard, right? Thinking about Gandalf as a wizard. But again, what does that mean? So I think this is why, I come back again now to the scene on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, because this moment when Gandalf stands up to the Balrog is one of the very first times that we get any clear information about exactly who and what Gandalf is, and of course it's relatively cryptic. And first of all, I want to apologize. I have unfortunately come down with a really bad head cold today, so my voice is a little more hoarse than usual. It means that I'm not going to be able to do a very good strident Gandalf on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm voice, so I apologize in advance for my comparatively wussy Gandalf on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm here. "You cannot pass," he said. The orc stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." Okay, so what exactly, in this one moment when Gandalf kind of pulls the curtain aside, right? And he sort of pulls the veil aside. And remember, we saw a nonverbal moment like this way back in Bag End at the end of Chapter 1 of the Fellowship of the Ring, right? You know, when Gandalf threatens Bilbo with Gandalf the Grey uncloaked, right? That's one of the first hints that we have that this appearance, this, you know, gray-clad wizard that we've been seeing and kind of taking for granted ever since we met him in The Hobbit, is only a cloaking, right? Is only you know, an external semblance that is being used by this creature called Gandalf, in a sense, to conceal who he really is. And who he really is apparently something very much greater in stature. When he talks about, you know, being uncloaked there to Bilbo, he seems to grow and fill the whole room. But again, you know, that's sort of vague and, you know, impressive, but nonverbal. Here he you know, he pulls that veil back again, much more fully. He reveals himself to the Balrog, first visually, as we see him as this shining light on the bridge, where, you know, where again he seems to be sort of literally uncloaked, and then he identifies himself. And the two things really that he says about himself are, one, that he is a servant of the secret fire and wielder of the flame of Aenor. Now, that's the servant of the secret fire seems to be a reference to Iluvatar, of course, and the secret flame. Servant of the secret fire, what he seems to be suggesting to the Balrog here is essentially we're peers. The Balrog is larger than he is, though not colossally larger than he is. But basically, it's always seemed to me that what he's saying in that first part there, I am a servant of the secret fire, is, you know, Mr. Balrog, sir, you stomped your way out of the depths and, you know, killed all the dwarves, and you've been lording it over the orcs who are here. In some sense, it's a little unclear from the book exactly what the relationship is between the Balrog and the orcs. They obviously are afraid of it, and therefore sort of obey it. But is it, you know, is it a general? Is it the mastermind of their movements? You know, does it command them exactly? That's not 100% clear, actually. But anyway, you know, okay. So Balrog, you've been the, you know, the big kid on the block here ever since you came out of your slumber here in Moria. But that's not me. Right, I am not I am not just one of these dwarves and orcs and elves and men that you might expect to meet. I am of the same order that you are. I too was one of the Ainur. I too was, you know, there from the time of the music on forward. And then the second thing he says, that he's wielder of the flame of Aenor, that seems to be a reference to his ring. In what sense does Gandalf wield a flame? Well, we know he carries the ring of fire, Narya, which was given to him by Círdan the Shipwright. It's never called the flame of Aenor. Aenor just means sun. You know, Aenor and Itho are the sun and moon. So he says that he's the wielder of the flame of the sun. We don't really hear that phrase used about Narya, the Ring of Fire. But again, since we know he is wielding the Ring of Fire, that would seem to be what he's referring to. Now, of course, sort of the cumulative effect on the Balrog here, I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Aenor, seems to then segue into his, you know, his other statement, the dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Right, that is, your fire doesn't scare me, because, like, I'm a servant of the secret fire, and I'm the wielder of fire, too, so, like, you know, don't think you're going to destroy, you know, don't think your fire, you know, scares me, fire spirit. And, of course, it's dark fire, and he's not afraid of the dark fire, right, because he himself is the wielder of light, as he has revealed himself to be a servant of the light as well. So his light can illuminate the Balrog's darkness, and his fire can oppose the Balrog's fire. So although from the outset. Remember, the narrator has emphasized how uneven the battle looks, how small and frail Gandalf appears to be standing on the bridge, and how large and terrifying the Balrog seems to be in comparison. But Gandalf himself, in his words to the Balrog, is basically emphasizing we're peers here. You know, if you want a piece of this, it's going to be a little different than what you might expect. So again, this is the first thing we get, which really, within The Lord of the Rings, really reveals to us who and what Gandalf really is. Not only is he not just a man who's learned magic, he's not even, you know, one of the elves. That, of course, was apparently another theory. That's what his name means, Gandalf. Gandalf just means the wand elf or staff elf, and the story that Tolkien developed a good deal later on to sort of explain Gandalf's name is that that was a name that was given to him by men who thought, both because of his apparent magical ability and because of his apparent longevity, that they thought erroneously that he was an elf. So they called him Gandalf. They called him Wand Elf or Staff Elf. Of course, historically, that is, in the history of Tolkien's composition, it's a little bit more complicated. Gandalf was, of course, is the name of one of the dwarves from the Eddas. That is the same. It's from the same list of names that almost all of the other dwarves in the party, in Thorin's party, were taken from. So, you know, Dwalin and Keely and Feely and Owen and Glóin and all the rest of them. Gandalf is one of that list. And it's a dwarf name, and it's originally, I don't know why this name, the name called Wand Elf, was given to a dwarf, but that gets kind of complicated. Anyway, so Gandalf is a dwarf name and was originally one of the dwarves. The wizard's name, of course, in the first draft of The Hobbit, when the leader of the dwarves was Gandalf, was Bladorthin, which doesn't go down quite as nicely as Gandalf eventually. But anyway, so he's clearly distinguished himself as not just a human, not just an elf. He's revealed himself, and it's almost like he's telling a secret to the Balrog. You know, he is in the extremity of that moment, pushed into openly declaring something that it seems like there's only a handful of people in Middle-earth that know. So that's again one of the two passages in The Lord of the Rings where I think we learn most about Gandalf, and the other that I would draw attention to is his description of his resurrection when he meets up with Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn again, and they ask him, "Hey, you know, what happened? You know, tell us how you fared with the Balrog." And let me pause here for a second. Josh Aeoliolf was asking, you know, wasn't Gandalf Aloran, Amaya of Manwë and Varda? Yes, I'm trying to be a little cautious here. Because the place where that is said is written substantially later than The Lord of the Rings. Right now I'm talking about what we actually learn in The Lord of the Rings itself. Because remember, Tolkien, you know, one of the things that Tolkien does is to fill in his stories and to, you know, I mean, he's the king of retcon, you know, so a lot of all of that stuff, all the Aloran stuff came later and was basically inserting this backstory for Gandalf and developing this backstory for Gandalf. So the idea of Gandalf and who he was really grew in Tolkien's mind after the fact. But we see very, very little evidence of it, certainly not in The Hobbit, and very little evidence before this point within The Lord of the Rings. So that's why I'm wanting to start here with just thinking explicitly about what we learn actually in the text itself, in the story of The Lord of the Rings. So I will, I'll read, this is of course in the White Rider chapter of the Two Towers. This is after he follows the Balrog up the endless stair. There upon Celebdil was a lonely window in the snow, and before it lay a narrow space, a dizzy eyrie above the mists of the world. The sun shone fiercely there, but all below was wrapped in cloud. Out he sprang, and even as I came behind, he burst into new flame. There was none to see, or perhaps in after ages, songs would still be sung of the battle of the peak. Suddenly Gandalf laughed. But what would they say in song? Those that looked up from afar thought that the mountain was crowned with storm. Thunder they heard, and lightning, they said, smote upon Celebdil, and leaped back broken into tongues of fire. Is not that enough? A great smoke rose about us, vapor and steam. Ice fell like rain. I threw down my enemy, and he fell from the high place and broke the mountainside where he smote it in his ruin. Then darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time, and I wandered far on roads that I will not tell. Naked I was sent back, for a brief time, until my task is done, and naked I lay upon the mountain-top. The tower behind was crumbled into dust, the window gone, the ruined stair was choked with burned and broken stone. I was alone, forgotten, without escape upon the hard horn of the world. There I lay staring upward, while the stars wheeled over, and each day was as long as a life-age of the earth. Faint to my ears came the gathered rumor of all lands, the springing and the dying, the song and the weeping, and the slow everlasting groan of overburdened stone. And so at the last, Gwaihir the Windlord found me again, and he took me up and bore me away. Now, think again here. What do we learn? What have we learned about Gandalf throughout this passage? Note how cryptic he is again, in the way that he talks about this stuff, right? I strayed out of thought and time and wandered far on roads I will not tell, right? Like, that's the Gandalf we're kind of familiar with. No servant of the secret fire here. No revealing of his true identity, even though, again, even the whole servant of the secret fire thing is still sufficiently cryptic. Almost nobody who hears him understands what he's talking about. But anyway, so he's being even more cryptic. Wandered far on roads I will not tell, presumably metaphorical roads he's talking about wandering on. But he does in fact drop a little bit of information, right? Naked I was sent back, he says. That's important, right? That's a genuine piece of information right there. Naked I was sent back. Okay. That tells us that he was sent. Notice Gandalf's kind of infuriating use of the passive voice here. He doesn't say who does the sending, right? Just that he was sent. So we know someone has sent him. So, combined now with what we learned before, we know that he is one of the Ainur. He is one of those spirits that was there from the beginning. We know that he has been sent to Middle-earth. We know that he is now being sent back. He makes no hint here of exactly who it is who sends him back. But anyway, we know that he was sent. His being sent back suggests that he was sent the first time until my task is done, right? That's even more explicit than the sending reference, right? Not only is he being sent, he's being sent with a task. But again, presumably he had a task in the first place, a task which was not yet done, and thus, for that reason, he was sent back. And he will remain only so long as his task remains uncompleted. So that's some definite information that we get. Then we get this long and rather curious description, right? There I lay staring upward while the stars wheeled over, and each day was as long as a life age of the earth. Now we can understand this in a couple different ways, right? On the literal sense, he's trapped, right? There's nothing he can do. He says that the way down, he's up on this inaccessible peak, or rather the only way it was accessible was through the stair from within Moria, and that stair has now been destroyed. So he's stuck. So again, you can understand it in the simplest possible way to say that, like, well, it really seemed like a long time because I was up there and there was nothing to do and there was no way to escape and I didn't know what was going to be going on. But anyway, here I was, and so it makes sense on the simplest level, but um, but there's more than that, right? There certainly seems to be more than that. The way that he seems to be, I hate to use this word because this word sounds really cheesy, but the way in which he seems to be kind of communing with the world around him. Faint to my ears came the gathered rumor of all lands, the springing and the dying, the song and the weeping, and the slow everlasting groan of overburdened stone. Having been sent back and lying here naked on the hard horn of the world, he seems to be, in this sense, in touch with Middle-earth in a really deep sense. At first, at least whenever I read this, faint to my ears came the gathered rumor of all lands. At first I sort of assume that means he's going to find out what's going on, right? Like, so he hears about what happens to Frodo and everything else, right? That he's, so somehow he's going to be kind of keeping his finger on the pulse of what's happening around in Middle-earth. But that doesn't seem to be what he's referring to. The gathered rumor of all lands seems to be the springing and the dying, that is, the cycle of life in the world, the song and the weeping, the slow everlasting groan of overburdened stone. Just sort of the way that the very mountains of Middle-earth themselves feel their own weight and feel their own age as the ages of Middle-earth grind their way on. It's a very kind of deep and broad, kind of connection with the world, or perception of the world, perhaps, that he has here when he has woken up again. And again, again, it's not that I think we get any really specific information from that passage, but again, I find it very interesting. And one of the reason I find it so interesting is that we know that, thinking back to, what he's just said about being sent back and about his task being done. And of course, on the one hand, we know what his task is, right? Or at least, if we ask ourselves that question, so what's Gandalf's task? That seems like an easy question, right? Well, he's there to fight against Sauron, right, and to support the enemies of Sauron. So, this is what he's been doing. You think of Aragorn's speech, on the field after the Battle of Pelennor, when he says, in all of these things, Gandalf has been the chief, right? Sorry, I'm quoting Elrond and thinking about Aragorn, but Aragorn talking about how he has been, as he has begun, so he will go on, and how he's been deferring to Gandalf and urges everybody to listen to him. He's the central mover of the war against Sauron. That's his task, right? And yet, in this moment, his description of his first days here, sent back and returning to Middle-earth, it seems like it almost goes sort of deeper than that. That the very life of the world itself is something that is part of his care. And remember the speech that he makes about stewardship to Denethor, right? That, he will not have entirely failed in his task if anything lives, to grow and to thrive in years to come, even should Gondor be destroyed. And, there's that sense in which it's not just a kind of a narrow, I'm here to defeat Sauron job. That's his central job, of course. But again, a sense in which he is, at least in part, a steward of the life of the entirety of Middle-earth. And again, I think he gives us a very brief glimpse of that there. And then, of course, Gwaihir shows up and takes him. Now, you'll notice the parallel between this and the top of Orthanc, right? Not just the fact that Gwaihir came and took him off, both of them. But you remember, where does Saruman leave him? What is the place that he gets taken to? In Orthanc, you remember? Remember what is? Does anyone recall what is specifically said about it? What's it for? It's the highest point of Orthanc. What's its purpose? I mean, that is, when it's not being used as a place for the in-house arrest of fellow wizards. Yes, Josh, you've got it. Watching the stars. That's the place where from which Saruman watches the stars. So here's Gandalf, stranded, alone, up on the top of the pinnacle of Orthanc, in the place where Saruman was wont to watch the stars, until the eagle comes and rescues him. And here on Caledil, what do we get? There I lay staring upward while the stars wheeled over. Until Gwaihir, there on the hard horn of the world, until Gwaihir comes and takes him away again. It seems, in retrospect, that the capture of Gandalf and his rescue by Gwaihir, as significant an event as that seemed at the time, was only actually a kind of foreshadowing of this event, which is in its way really much bigger. Yeah, Laura points out that moths hang out there. That's clearly that's what it's for. That's where Saruman keeps his moth pheromones. Apparently, yeah. I agree. That's clearly true. But anyway, so that parallel I find very striking, and I love the way in which that earlier scene is invested with this sort of additional significance through the parallel, a significance which of course Saruman himself couldn't possibly have anticipated. Anyway, so let's see. Someone was asking the question. Valori was asking, "Why naked?" It just says, was Glorfindel sent back naked too? No, this is not just because I want to hear about naked elves. Yeah, I think, Valori, I agree. I think that naked Glorfindel is probably, that begins to sound too much like a really questionable romance novel spinoff. But no, Glorfindel would likely not have been naked, because when he returns, he seems to return in as much as Tolkien himself clarified this, he seems to return by boat, possibly with the Astari, showing up with the Astari at the coming over from Valinor by boat. So he was presumably clothed, as Gandalf also, and the rest of the wizards were all presumably didn't all troop off the boat naked, but here this is definitely as Turvo says, it's a rebirthing motif. He is being reborn there on the mountainside, but though it's interesting the way he characterizes it in that regard, right? I mean, it is like a rebirth, but it's also near the ending. Right, he says, for a little time, just until my task is done. He's pretty clear about the fact that although this is, in a sense, a kind of rebirth for him, it's not a rebirth in the sense of a new beginning. It's merely, a new beginning of his end, really. But there definitely is that kind of birth imagery with it. He seems to have been given a new body. Some people that I've spoken to in the past have sort of wondered from reading this passage whether Gandalf ever actually died. I mean, did he just pass out? I mean, did he just fall unconscious and then wake up again after a while? And I think not. I think we're definitely to conclude that he died. And so he is given, in a sense, a new body. This is why, Gandalf, I've often joked and called him Gandalf 2.0 after his resurrection. The Gandalf that we see after Valentine's Day is quite different, and physically different, not just different in how he speaks, not just different in how he acts, not just different in the way that he expresses his power and sort of wields his authority. He's seems to be substantially physically different, so he does seem to have been given a new body to be to be made incarnate in a new way here. Again, you'll notice, as I often do when I talk about this, I try to resist using the word reincarnated, though it's literally accurate, it seems, because that word has a lot of freight to it. You know, people have a lot of ideas of various kinds associated with the idea of reincarnation. And so simply saying, I try never just to toss off in a sentence, Gandalf was reincarnated, because that can lead to lots and lots of different kinds of confusion there. Anyway, these are the two passages that I wanted to really focus on from the Lord of the Rings to try to understand as this story unfolds. You know, where is Gandalf, and what is Tolkien's understanding of Gandalf? I do want to move to some of those later conceptions when Tolkien was really trying to bring all this together and explain it a good deal more. There are two other passages that I want to talk about and share with you here. Both of these from Unfinished Tales, from the section on the Astari in Unfinished Tales. The first is just an explanation of what the wizards in general are. And again, thinking of Gandalf and of his task and of his character in particular, I think, you know, we can hear some really interesting things in this paragraph. Emissaries they were from the lords of the West, the Valar, who still took counsel for the governance of Middle-earth, and when the shadow of Sauron first began to stir again, they took this means of resisting him. For with the consent of Eru, they sent members of their own high order, but clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain, though because of their noble spirits they did not die, and aged only by the cares and labors of many long years. And this the Valar did. Okay, well, let me pause for a second here. So we're first told some basic facts about them, right? What's their purpose? They're emissaries, right? They're being sent by the Valar to Middle-earth. Why? Because the Valar still took counsel for the governance of Middle-earth. Have the Valar, in fact, forgotten about Middle-earth? Humans have been accusing the Valar of forgetting about Middle-earth ever since the First Age. Like, humans in Beleriand were accusing the Valar of having forgotten them, and not ever really paid much attention to humans at all, or Middle-earth much. So one thing is we're being we're being told that the Valar definitely are interested, and they sent emissaries over, and that's who the Astari are, and it's their explicit purpose is to resist Sauron. Okay. This was done with the consent of Eru, but by the power and will of the Valar. They're called members of their own, that is the Valar's own high order. Right, so again, we got the whole Servant of the Secret Fire thing, right? They also are Ainur. You know, they're lesser spirits than the great among the Valar, but they're still of that order. But they're going to be put into real bodies. And you remember there's that long description that I just read that emphasizes very clearly, very strongly, what exactly that means, right? The Valar and the Maiar can appear in bodies. You know, of course, the biggest, most obvious example of this we have is Melian, right? Who appeared in a body that could get married and bear a child, right? So we know, obviously, that the Valar are able to embody themselves. But there's more here than just the embodiment of Maiar, you know, of these high spirits in physical form, so that they can go among the people of Middle-earth. We're told that for whatever reason, instead of just going in their Super Valar embodiments, or, you know, Maya embodiments, they're really incarnated in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, subject to fears and pains and weariness of the earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain. Though they don't die, that is, they don't die of old age, but they do get aged, in a sense, by the cares and labors of many long years. So they can get tired, They can get weary, but they don't die of old age. But they can be killed. Okay, so why did they do this? And this the Valar did, continuing on now, desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of elves or men by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. So, why did the Valar do this? Why did they give them those specially incarnated bodies? Well, Tolkien says, and this is all in that essay on the Astari that he wrote in the mid-50s. This is right after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. So, this is one of those things that he's, in that time, right as The Lord of the Rings is being published in the years immediately after the publication, he's doing a lot of things to kind of answer questions and clarify things that people were uncertain about. And this essay on the Astari is one of those big efforts right in that time. So why did the Valar do this? They desired to amend the errors of old. That is, for those of you who know the Silmarillion will remember that when the elves first appeared, what the Valar did was they said, hey, let's run out and let's go over and invite the elves. So the elves woke up in Middle-earth. That's great, but that's really kind of inconvenient because it's quite far away, and we'd like to have them near us. So let's reveal ourselves to them, and let's bring them home to live with us, and we will live with them in glory here, and we'll share our glory here in Valinor, and everything's going to be awesome in Valinor, and the rest of Middle-earth, well, we won't worry about that so much right now. And of course, that's what they did. Now, that was, it's pretty clear, a bad move on their part. They were wrong to have done that. And this seems to be their own recognition that their approach with the elves was wrong. They shouldn't have gone over in their revealing themselves in their full glory and inviting the elves to come back and live with them like kinsmen in Valinor. They should have left the elves where they were and probably not even revealed themselves to them in the way that they did. So, having learned their lesson, the Valar are going to try this a different way this time. And that's why we have this radically different policy. So note, Tolkien is saying this doesn't mean that the Valar are paying less attention to, humans, are paying less attention to people in the Third Age, right? That, the Valar brought their A game against Melkor, but, when it comes to Sauron, they send in the, they send in the second string, right, or the third string in the Astari. Tolkien explicitly is saying here that's not the case. It might be easy to make that assumption, to draw that conclusion, but that's not true. They're doing it this way not because they don't care, but because they do care, and because they learned that the way they did it the first time was a really bad idea. And there's even a hint at why it's a bad idea. The Istari are forbidden to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power. They are forbidden to reveal themselves. This is why Gandalf is so coy about it. This is why he never talks about it, except, privately to Balrogs, right? Because they're not supposed to reveal their full glory. They're not allowed to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power. And again, the reason for that becomes pretty clear. Why? Because they're trying to oppose Sauron, who, if he comes again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. That's how Sauron is going to operate. And again, there seems to be a little bit of that seems to be almost a tacit kind of confession on the part of that sort of that Tolkien seems to be giving to the Valar there of, yeah, the way we did it the first time was really bad. That again, we were a little bit more like Morgoth than we're comfortable thinking about. There needs to be a bigger difference between. Now they were just showing love to the elves. There was already. I'm not saying there's no difference between how they related to the elves and how Morgoth did. but there's this desire to draw a much sharper distinction here. So okay, so that's what we're told about what the wizards are, and obviously a bunch of that relates to Gandalf. But let's look at Gandalf a little bit more explicitly. This is in that same essay on the Astari. The passage I just read was from page 389, if you're interested, in the Unfinished Tales. And this is just from the next page, from 390. But the last comer, that is the last of all the Astari to arrive in Middle-earth, the last comer was named among the elves Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, for he dwelt in no place, and gathered to himself neither wealth nor followers, but ever went to and fro in the Westlands, from Gondor to Angmar, and from Lindon to Lorien, befriending all folk in times of need. Warm and eager was his spirit, and it was enhanced by the ring Narya, for he was the enemy of Sauron, opposing the fire that devours and wastes with the fire that kindles and succors in wan hope and distress. But his joy and his swift wrath were veiled in garments grey as ash, so that only those that knew him well glimpsed the flame that was within. I love this description of Gandalf's fire. In what way does that? You think of that fire versus fire thing that Gandalf points to when he's talking to the Balrog, right? Don't try your fire thing on me, Balrog, right? I've got fire too, and my fire is more than capable of opposing your fire, right? Well, how so? I mean, not just in like a literal we're throwing fireballs at each other sense. This is talking about Gandalf's fire in more than like the lore master sticky gourd sense. This is him talking about the fire of Gandalf, and really what it meant. Like, what kind of fire did he have? How was the fire of his spirit enhanced by the ring Narya? What kind of fire is associated with Narya? How is it like the flame of Anor, the fire of the sun, in fact? Well, he was opposing the fire that devours and wastes with the fire that kindles and succors in wan hope and distress. This is something I think that a lot of people in modern times have a harder time relating to. That is, since we have electric heat and gas heat, by and large, we don't associate fire with warmth and life and hope. Right, fire that succors in wan hope and distress. Very few of us have, I would wager, been in a position where you think of the conversation that the Fellowship have on the slopes of the Redhorn Pass, right? Where the choice has come between fire and death. I think very few of us have faced the choice between fire and death, and you think of the way that fire brought life and hope to the hobbits, there in the snow, in the Misty Mountains at the beginning of Book 2. That's the kind of fire that he's talking about. The fire that kindles and succors in wan hope and distress. Wan hope being that marvelous old Anglo-Saxon and Middle English word for despair. But his joy and his swift wrath, right? So again, we see him being fiery in both ways. Swift in anger, quick to laugh, as Frodo says of him in his eulogy song that he sings in Lorien. Anyway, I'll carry on with his description. Merry he could be, and kindly to the young and simple, and yet quick at times to sharp speech and the rebuking of folly. But he was not proud, and sought neither power nor praise, and thus far and wide he was beloved among all those that were not themselves proud. Mostly he journeyed unwearyingly on foot, leaning on a staff, and so he was called among men of the north Gandalf, the elf of the wand. For they deemed him, though in error as has been said, to be of elven kind, since he would at times work wonders among them, loving especially the beauty of fire, and yet such marvels he wrought mostly for mirth and delight, and desired not that any should hold him in awe or take his counsels out of fear. I love, by the way, the connections all the way back to the Hobbit in that last sentence. Yet such marvels he wrought mostly for mirth and delight. that is fireworks, right? Enjoying the beauty of fire for mirth and delight, right? And desired not that any should hold him in awe or take his counsels out of fear. There was always that possibility about Gandalf, wasn't there, back at the beginning, right? When we see Gandalf as we are introduced to him at the beginning of The Hobbit, right? He is he's the story writer. He's the adventure maker, and I think that chapter 1. You go back and you look at Gandalf in chapter 1 of The Hobbit. The way he arranges for adventures doesn't really get Bilbo's consent before choosing to send him on the adventure, and the only motivation that he gives for himself as to why Bilbo is going to be chosen to be sent on the adventure is that it will be very amusing for Gandalf. Gandalf thinks it's funny to send Bilbo on this adventure, which kind of puts Gandalf in a strange kind of place. And then he shows up at the party, and he's kind of strange and sorcerous at times, and he kind of pulls rank, right? If I say a burglar, then a burglar he is or will be when the time comes, right? And he threatens Thorin and glowers at him and kind of cows him into accepting Bilbo and cows Bilbo into not complaining anymore. These are so that idea of people holding him in awe or taking his counsels out of fear, we're a lot close to that at the beginning of The Hobbit, right? So you can see him in that one sentence both recalling the very earliest thing that we learn about Gandalf, namely that he has awesome fireworks displays, and also kind of softening some of the early depiction of Gandalf that we get, making him to be even more virtuous with this particular kind of humble virtue than we actually saw him, especially during the course of The Hobbit. So this is Tolkien sort of in the middle of his biggest sort of Gandalf apologist phase. This essay that he wrote right afterwards, he's very, very big on Gandalf being the only one of the Astari that succeeded. That Radagast failed. We're told that in like 2 sentences that Radagast failed. And the Blue Wizards, we don't know what happened to them, but they probably failed, he says, at about this time. He begins to rethink these things later on. In particular, the fate of the Blue Wizards. When he returns to thinking about the Astari much later, like 20 years later, in the final year before his death, so this is way up in like 1972, this is when he goes back and he gives the Blue Wizards their new names in the East, which sound very heroic and sort of suggests that maybe the Blue Wizards actually didn't completely fail, and that they actually did some good. Whereas again, in the early stages, right after the Lord of the Rings, he wants to kind of shine as much of a spotlight on Gandalf as possible and make him into sort of as big a deal as possible. So we can see him here through this essay on the Astari, kind of giving us some background, filling in and creating background that helps to contextualize both how Gandalf acts, how he doesn't act, and kind of filling in the background of those hints that we get during the course of the narrative. One last thing I want to address, and then I will sort of open it for more questions, and I'll let you go pretty soon. And that is, I can't talk about the resurrection of Gandalf without even mentioning the question that I get asked so many times about Gandalf and his resurrection, and that is, to what extent, if any, are we supposed to understand Gandalf as a Jesus figure in his resurrection? The whole Gandalf as Jesus thing is something which is very popular, and a lot of people ask about that. And one of the things that I hope the stuff I've already talked about Gandalf and the Astari and his task, and the circumstances of his being sent back and of his reincarnation. What I hope that has helped to make a little bit clearer is why I've never been particularly compelled by that parallel. That is, Gandalf is like Jesus in as much as he seems to come back from the dead. That's a thing that Jesus and Gandalf have in common. You can even sort of, it's even possible to go a little further than that and think about some kind of specific parallels between the way in which Gandalf is different post-resurrection and the way in which Jesus is different post-resurrection. Jesus also is not exactly the same in his depiction in the Gospels. He does things like teleport himself places and apparently disguise his appearance and walk through walls and that kind of thing. So you know, there are some. It's you know, there are definitely parallels that you can make, but in my mind, the main thing that I always come back to when thinking about that question is what is the sort of symbolic link that is, like, other than that somewhat mechanical similarity between the two of them, what else do the two of them have in common? The resurrection of Jesus, okay, everybody, here's the understatement of the day. In the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus is kind of a big deal, right? That is to say, it's way more than, you know, when Jesus comes back, he's not like, my task is not yet done, so I was sent back for a short time. Like, he is only back for a short time before he ascends again. But, you know, the resurrection of Jesus is not just about being like, I had some unfinished business here, right? So I came back for a little bit, cleaned stuff up, and then I'm going to head off after this, right? That's not what the resurrection of Jesus is about. And so this is why I, in my opinion, a lot of people, you know, I've read, you know, many sort of Christian readers who have wanted to make a big deal of the parallels between Gandalf and Jesus, and I think that it actually does a disservice to Tolkien's religious symbolism in The Lord of the Rings. I do think that Tolkien is very interested in religious ideas. As I said, as I hinted, I don't think it's a pure coincidence that the Fellowship leaves Rivendell on December 25th. However, I think that to simply say, you know, to try to make an argument that Gandalf equals Jesus is kind of missing the point. Not only missing the point about the Lord of the Rings, but missing the point about the Gospels, in fact. That the more you look at it, the less interesting and convincing that parallel really becomes. I mean, in my mind, the sacrifice that Frodo makes, it's still not, Frodo isn't Jesus either. It's just not the way Tolkien's story works. But Frodo's sacrifice is even a little bit more Christ-like to me than, you know, in my mind, than Gandalf's in that way. So again, I certainly don't want to suggest. You know, I'm not trying to make an anti, you know, religious and Christian applicability argument against the Lord of the Rings, but I've always found that simple parallel to be far too simple, and not really very useful in the end. Okay, so I'm happy to take, if there are questions that you guys have, passages I didn't talk about, or references that you know, that you'd like to ask. I can't promise to be able to answer every question, but happy to take more questions here. Yeah, good. And yes, Luke, I did miss your MythCon 45 talk. Remember, I arrived right after it happened. I didn't know when it was. Yes. Elizabeth asks, how about the parallels between Gandalf and Odin? Those, I think, actually are a little bit more interesting, you know, in the sense that Odin is depicted as an old man who's sort of wandering the earth. But see, even there, I don't find it. In the end, I don't find it too convincing. I mean, there are definitely some similarities there, but but the biggest thing, like, this is going to be really crude. I'm going to apologize in advance to Norse mythology for this, but when Odin travels around the world, he's doing it essentially as a spook, right? That is, he's like checking in on things and finding out what's going on. And it's, you know, the stories of Odin traveling around as an old man are similar to stories that you get in many other traditions. You know, as you know, Zeus does a similar thing. He's not as famous for it as Odin, but he also goes around, and of course what Zeus is doing is to check on how hospitable people are, right? He goes, he disguises himself as a mortal, and knocks on people's door and asks for hospitality, and if hospitality is denied to him, you're in big trouble, right? And Odin does similar kinds of things, you know, he's, so that is, my point is, in that way, Odin and Gandalf are very different in their relationship with things, right? Odin has real power and he has authority and he will use it, right? He conceals himself, right? He disguises himself, but he disguises himself chiefly in order to find out about stuff, right? To uncover what's really going on. But Gandalf isn't like that, right? Gandalf is a servant, more genuinely a servant than Odin is. He's just going around to learn about things and to find out how he can help people and how he can kindle their hearts to fire. That's his job, right? His job is not even to accomplish anything himself, but to help others have the will and the spirit to be able to accomplish things, right? And in that, I don't see a really compelling similarity in that sense between Gandalf and, oh, Josh was asking about Odin at exactly the same time. So yeah, there we go. Good, let's see. Yeah, good, let's see. Yeah, Aaron is asking about the blue caste of Kundalar sorcerers that you meet in the Brownlands. I haven't met them, so I can't speak to them in any detail, but I do know that they are designed to echo the Blue Wizards. Chris Pearson, the senior lore master at Turbine, talked about that when he came to Mythmoot, to our Mythgard's conference last month. And you know, that was on their part a very deliberate nod to the Blue Wizards, to whom they cannot officially refer within the game because they don't have the rights to Unfinished Tales, and so therefore, and the Blue Wizards are never actually mentioned. Just the fact that there are two other wizards out there of some indeterminate color, so the Blue Wizards could never actually be mentioned in game itself. And he did say that blue cast of sorcerers is sort of a hint at that. So you can see that Chris Pearson and the Turbine people were working with this sort of early idea, that is the idea of the Blue Wizards that was contemporary with that stuff about Gandalf that I was just reading. Roughly contemporary with this essay on the Astari right after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. And at that time, he was saying, most famously in one of his letters, that he doesn't know what came of the Blue Wizards. Let me see, I actually have it here, so I don't want to mess it up here. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I had it right here. Oh yes, here it is. I think, he says, they went as emissaries to distant regions, east and south, far out of Númenórean range. Missionaries to enemy-occupied lands, as it were. What success they had I do not know, but I fear they failed, as Saruman did, though doubtless in different ways, and I suspect they were founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. That's what the Turbine guys were alluding to in those blue wizards, blue-ish wizards, or blue semi-wizards, I guess, in the Brownlands, is that letter, and that was in 1958. So it was a few years after the essay on the Astari, but it was still in that general period. Yeah, and Robert was asking, what do I think about what LOTRO has done with Gandalf and Radagast? Well, I think, first of all, they haven't done all that. I mean, I haven't seen them do all that much with Gandalf yet, mostly because, of course, Gandalf is very much part of the sort of main Fellowship storyline. So we keep getting Gandalf's voiceovers, and he sends you off places from the Prancing Pony, and you get minor quests to him in Rivendell and that kind of thing. So he's not so dynamic a character. And I never thought I would say Gandalf is not nearly so dynamic a character as Radagast, but LOTRO is one of the places where you can say that, right? I actually love what they've done with Radagast in the Lone Lands. I really like Radagast at Oscaruth, and the way that they depict his character seems to me a really interesting balance between making him more active, more kind of Gandalf-like, right? That is more successful as a wizard, and yet being true to the very, very, very few things that we know about him. That is, principally, that he's associated with the color brown and is the friend of birds, is the friend of good beasts, and birds are especially his friends. So anyway, I do think that's I like the fact that they have kind of highlighted Radagast, and I have to say I was kind of chuckling the first time I went through the Epic Quest line and was doing the front half of Book 2. Remember, that's the stuff up in Candaith's encampment up there by Weathertop, right? And the whole point is you've been sent to try to find Radagast, and so you're asking this ranger, hey, have you seen Radagast? And he's constantly like, Radagast? Oh, I don't know, man. Like, he's kind of hard to find. We'll have to try to dig him up. And it takes him forever as he's, like, lying there in his camp, reclining suavely and never really seeming to bestir himself. But he... So anyway, I mean, I thought it was a little bit comical, a sort of a comical nod to the way in which Radagast vanishes from the Fellowship of the Ring, right? He's there to warn Gandalf, and then he just disappears and is never, ever heard from again. And so, the fact that you're trying to track him down and people are like, Radagast, don't know him, haven't seen him, don't know what's going on, I thought was really hilarious. But anyway, when we did finally meet him, I was really quite pleased. I think, I mentioned that at the time, in that time in the mid-50s there, Tolkien was like really, really trying to build up. This is one of the moments where you can see Tolkien really trying to influence the interpretation of the Lord of the Rings, right? He clearly, well, I say clearly, let me emphasize, this is my own interpretation of the stuff that Tolkien said during that time. But I believe that Tolkien was trying to make sure that everybody, as many people as possible who read the books got the fact that Gandalf is a really big deal, right? He doesn't want anybody to overlook Gandalf. Like, just because he's not all that flashy, just because he's not in charge, just because he does stay in the background and, he's not a king or anything like that, Frodo's a big deal and Aragorn's a big deal, but don't miss the fact that Gandalf is the real deal, right? That he is the major figure, the major mover of all of these events. He seemed to really want to emphasize that, and I honestly think, especially in the essay on the Astari, that he really just threw poor Radagast under the bus in an attempt to kind of build up Gandalf and make sure everybody noticed how awesome Gandalf was. As even Christopher Tolkien himself admits in the commentary that he writes on this, even Christopher Tolkien says that he finds the things that Tolkien said about Radagast to be puzzling. He's very diplomatic in saying it. I'm less diplomatic and want to say it's almost nonsensical what he says. That is the idea that Radagast's friendship with birds and beasts would be like some kind of inhibitor, that like because he got too close to the birds and beasts and cared too much for these lesser living creatures, that means he failed. Like, you can tell he failed because of how, like, that just does not seem to fit with almost anything else in Tolkien, and is especially puzzling and this is where Christopher Tolkien is pointing it out. It is especially puzzling in conjunction with the fact that in those later writings, Tolkien is speculating that Radagast was sent over to Middle-earth by Yavanna, the Valar who's in charge of the animals and the trees. So, like, seriously, one of the servants of Yavanna comes over, and is Yavanna really going to be looking at him and saying, oh gosh, I don't know, he's a little too friendly with birds and beasts, I really, that's not the point, you shouldn't really put birds and beasts first. Hard for me to imagine Yavanna saying that. And again, Christopher Tolkien even sort of acknowledges that. So my own interpretation there is that I think that Tolkien got a little bit kind of carried away in wanting to build up how awesome Gandalf is, and like, no slight to how awesome Gandalf is, but I've always been a little disappointed by what he kind of did to Radagast there in those scenes. This is why I loved what the LOTRO people did with Radagast in Book One, because he's not he's not like unstoppably awesome, though. Boy, when I first was fellowed with him as like a level 20 or level 25 or something like that, and he had 139,000 hit points, I was pretty impressed. But but anyway, still, he's not, he's even in that time when you're fellowing with him, in that quest when you're fellowing with him, he still spends almost his entire, like, he leaves you to fight all the undead and spends all of his time rescuing frogs and things like that. So, it's not without, totally without its comic elements, but nevertheless, it is nice to see him then, finally, like, reach back and put the smack down on Ivar. Again, I was really happy to see Radagast get a little something back, because he was always a character that I found really intriguing. Now, good, Josh assures me there'll be a lot more with Gandalf in Book 3. I figured, and someday, by golly, I will get there. Someday I'm going to finish Eriador and move on to Volume 2 and 3 of the Epic Quest. I promise. I really will. Good. All right. Any final questions? I don't know, John, how you normally do things. I could kind of hand things back over to you here. So I think, yeah, you're still unmuted. You need to unmute your own mic, and then you can speak there, John, if you want to.
Yeah, well, we can either, I don't see any questions coming in at the moment, but I think that was, well, we're getting a really good response in Kim Chat. People are really enjoying this, so we could probably go all night, but I don't see any further questions coming in. I think maybe now would be a good time to have Old Wynyards close out the night.
Absolutely.
So, with that,
we've actually had a request that Corey stay for the music. So, if you would, Corey, the musicians have asked if they would be honored if you would stay for the set.
Absolutely.